Hi. Misha from Eventide is an entirely different and original way of performing and composing music, and is also a different kind of generative sequencer. With most instruments or controllers, pressing the same key plays the same note every time. With Misha, you use the keys to decide where you want a melody to go, as opposed to which specific notes to play. This is particularly useful when exploring the dozens of scales available on the module. Misha is a Eurorack module, though it can send and receive MIDI, so you can use it outside the context of a Eurorack system, and it can totally transform how a MIDI keyboard behaves if you connect one to it. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at Misha and discuss some pros and cons both of the module and this way of making music. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Eventide sent Misha over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with an overview. Misha is an interval-based controller and sequencer based on Leon Gruenbaum's Samchillion, a computer keyboard-based instrument where you play and program melodies based on how many intervals up or down you want a melody to go, as opposed to playing specific notes. This lets you explore different keys and different scales without really bothering with which white or black notes you need to play to make sure you stay in the scale. So for example, for the C blues scale, if I want to play up and down the scale, I just need to go up one interval in the scale. Same thing for going down the scale. Go down single intervals. Note that we're going up and down notes in the scale, not semitones. Going up two intervals is an easy way to create arpeggios. And repeating patterns with different intervals can quickly create interesting riffs. Now, these same riffs will sound totally different in other potentially interesting scales. So a similar riff on the harmonic major scale would sound like this. And if you hook up an external MIDI keyboard, you can play these intervals with velocity. So I don't know if this sounds like I've been practicing the harmonic major scale, but I haven't. And I think it's just a fun way to play up and down the scale based on what you feel and not whether you know the notes or not. And each scale has its own character. This is the character of this scale. The disadvantage of this system is that if you're used to playing specific notes, you're going to have to get used to this. So if I wanted to play the APC song, it goes something like this. And I assure you, unlike the harmonic major scale, I had to practice this one. So it's basically same note, plus 4 interval, same note, up 1 interval, same note, and then down 1 interval. So it's a bit odd, especially pressing 0 when you want to play the same note. That takes getting used to. So that essentially is the core idea of Misha, but then it adds onto it quite a few performance and generative sequencing features, which we'll look at in a bit. Before we get into that, let's just complete a tour of the module. Aside from the 9 interval buttons, Misha has 4 user buttons, which you can configure to do whatever you want. By default, they go up and down octaves and semitones, as opposed to intervals. So if you do want to get out of the scale, you can do that very quickly. And you can customize these to do quite a few other functions. The list is fairly long. The buttons aren't velocity sensitive, another reason why connecting a keyboard is useful. Front and center is an LCD screen. It's not OLED, but it's got fairly good viewing angles. You control typically the 2 parameters by turning these knobs, and these are push encoders. Sometimes you'll have additional options. So for example, if you see a little arrow here, it means that you can cycle between the modes of the major scale. Then this button is an undo button. If you play an interval you don't like, these buttons will cycle through a few screens. And if you long press them, they have another function. This one is for saving and loading presets. And this one is for changing the chords. And then occasionally these three buttons will have different functions. If you say press a shift, for example, then this cycles through the different presets, this button will go to preset 1. Then this button lets you record tone row sequences. We'll talk about what that is. And this button lets you play them back. Aside from determining the key and the scale, you can also determine the note range that Misha will play. So if I go up too far, it'll wrap around. And if I want that range to be smaller, I would just do something like this. And the octave you're playing is down below here. So as I expand the range, you'll see more octaves around here. This little square tells you the active octave. If you want to disable this wraparound, you can. In the center of the screen, you'll always see the solfège wheel that represents your scale. And yeah, there are plenty of both regular and microtonal scales here. There are two main modes here, more or less. One where these LEDs are colorful, and that's sort of like the general free play mode. And then once you record a sequence and you play it back, then the LEDs turn off, except for one which shows you the interval that you're playing through the sequence that you recorded. More on that later. But generally, if the LEDs aren't on, you're in sequence playback mode, and if they're on, you're in the general free play mode. In terms of connectivity, Misha has TRS-A MIDI jacks, both input and output. The input is used for connecting a keyboard, and the output is for sequencing either non-modular or modular gear with a MIDI input. You can clock Misha externally, and it has 3 pairs of CV gate outputs. The reason it has 3 pairs of outputs is for its chord mode. And then it has 3 CV gate input pairs. The reason it has pairs is that you can set values by either just sending it CV or sending it CV and gate, in which case it will only change a parameter once it sees a gate signal. Whether it's CV or MIDI, you can control, I think, pretty much any parameter in here externally if you want. It has a micro SD card slot for multiple purposes, including importing Scala scales if you want. You can put up to 100 user scales here, and the user scales don't overwrite the factory scales. So S1 is factory bank 1, then factory bank 2, and then user bank 1 and 2, which have a copy of the factory scales unless you change them. Then finally, Misha has a micro USB port. You use this for firmware updates, and currently you can also use this with an adapter that is micro SD on one side and USB host on the other. I don't have one, but the manual says you can use that to connect a regular keyboard to it in case you want to use a computer keyboard keys to control this. So you can perform with this the original way Leon did with his Samchillion. You can't currently connect a MIDI keyboard to this over USB, and this doesn't send MIDI over USB. Perhaps in a firmware update. Okay, so that's an overview of Misha. Let's dive in a little bit deeper. And for this, I'll choose a slightly more regular scale. Let's talk a bit about chords. In its essence, Misha is a monophonic instrument in the sense that there's a certain note where you're at, and then you move up and down from that note in various intervals. It's not designed to play chords, but you can. It's just that slight timing changes as you press the keys play totally different chords. You can program one of these buttons to be a home button. Home isn't just repeating the note, it's playing a specific note, C, in the center of the scale. Then if you program the home note either here or here, it'll still give you unexpected results, just in a different way. But again, it's really a matter of which node you press first. However, Misha does have a chord function. So if you hold this button, there are 3 ways you can change chords, either by turning this encoder and pressing it, in which case, yes, it will play the same chord every time, and the interval buttons shift the chord through the scale. Then another way to change chords is by using the chord up and down buttons, or just by pressing these buttons as long as you hold this down. So there are 9 chord combinations, and they are nicely chosen. You can't customize this fixed chord bank, at least not as of the current firmware, but that's certainly on my wish list. The chords, by the way, are sent in a way that the root note, the white note here, is sent at a velocity that's higher than the velocity of the other notes over MIDI, which is a nice touch. I think it doesn't apply over CV, but you can, of course, just decide to increase the level of one of the voices as opposed to the other two. And you can play these chords, of course, with the external keyboard too. Let's pick jazz. Okay, so that's how you play Misha live. Let's talk about its sequencer. To record a sequence, you just need to make sure that you're in this colorful mode and hit the record button, and then play your sequence with intervals, and then it starts playing back when you've hit a limit. So let's talk about that. True to its quirky form, sequencing with Misha isn't quite what you'd expect, at least as of the current firmware. You sequence what are called here tone rows. That's an intentional limitation designed to give equal opportunity to each note in a scale. You can't sequence the same note twice. So at least as of the current firmware, sequences are also limited in length to the number of notes in a scale. If you try to sequence the same note twice, it'll just find the nearest one to it and add that to the sequence. So for example, if I wanted to, say, start from here and record a sequence that starts here and goes up to D and then goes back one interval to C, then it'll go to B. If I go back up 2 intervals, it'll skip D and go to E and create a sequence that way. Now you could cheat if you wanted, go to a scale with a lot of notes, say this one, and record, something like this. And so that's our microtonal pattern. Then go back to, say, a major scale, in which case Misha will try and condense the notes in that sequence to the major scale. And here some notes will repeat within the tone row, though in different octaves. It's a cool limitation, but I hope they give you an option to turn it off. Anyway, let's just sequence a simple pattern and see what happens in autoplay or sequence playback mode. So there are quite a few generative options here. There's simple stuff, by the way, like 3-note length options. And you can restart the sequence if you like. Then there are a few playback options. So prime is the sequence playing forwards, retro is backwards, random is random, pendulum is ping pong. So far par for the course like many other sequencers, but this is where it gets interesting. Transpose will transpose the sequence either according to the circle of fifths or in semitones. You can configure that. Anyway, it'll do that every sequence cycle. And then translate shifts the sequence up and down while still adhering to the scale as opposed to transpose, which is chromatic. Both transpose and translate will go on forever, subject to the note range limits like I showed you earlier. So those are the general playback options for sequences. Let's take a look at the ways that you can interact with your sequence using the interval buttons, and you determine what the interval buttons do as the sequence is playing back by turning this encoder. So for example, clock divisions will let you use these buttons to speed the sequence up or slow it down. And you can fine-tune that by pressing this and changing the relative speed like that. So that's the clock division option. Let's take a look at a few more. Transpose, similar to the play option here, only here you can transpose the sequence manually, again either in intervals of according to the circle of fifths or in semitone intervals. And then translate works the same way as the play options. You can shift the sequence up and down the scale. This is opposed to the transpose function, which doesn't adhere to the scale. So manual control over translate is a nice way to explore scales. And then there's the octave control option. Again, fairly simple. You can transpose the sequence up and down octaves as it's playing back. And then finally in chord mode, you can use the interval buttons to select one of the 9 available chords. Another interesting way that I found to explore chords here is to record a sequence with just one step and then play around with the chords. Just listen to what they have to say and see what ideas come up when you play them in different sequences, in different scales. Okay, so those are almost all the ways that you can use these buttons as modifiers for tone row sequences. There's one more thing that I saved for last because it's a little bit complex. I'll start by recording a simple sequence. Goes into autoplay, and if we stop playback for a second, notice that the interval buttons aren't in their usual Technicolor mode. In this case, I can use the interval buttons to cycle through the tone row sequence. Now this is a simple tone row sequence, but as you can hear, I can play through it. When I reach the next interval, it's not going to go up higher to the higher octave because I'm playing through the tone row sequence. I'm not playing as I would say in this mode, where it would keep transposing up and down. Right? I'm playing the sequence. In this case, manually. I could also play through this tone row sequence in different intervals, say intervals of 2. And this is where things start to get generative. You can also play the intervals using an external keyboard as well. And you can see the different intervals light up here. So essentially, a tone row is kind of like our own custom scale with the same notes in a regular scale, but potentially in a different order had we recorded something that wasn't just us going through the scale manually. You can also use the interval buttons as modifiers to a sequence playing back in real time, shifting the pattern through the scale at the interval you choose to press. These shifts apply only once you press the button. So if you want the pattern to keep shifting, you need to keep pressing the button again and again for every step. So it takes a bit to wrap your head around that, but wait till you hear about the next feature. So you can actually create different sequences of intervals and play through the tone row that way. So if I hit play here, you'll notice that the +1 LED is blinking, indicating that we're moving through the sequence, through the tone row in increments of 1. But what if you wanted to play through your tone row, say, +1, +2, and then back to +1 and so forth? I'm glad you asked. You can. If you hit this user 4 button, and you can see this little plus here, you can add a +2. And now it's going to alternate between +1 and +2. Let's maybe add a -1 to that sequence. And now it's playing through the sequence in different intervals through the tone row sequence. Let's maybe choose a more interesting scale. Let's go for blues. There's no swing option here, which would have been nice. Maybe make this a bit faster. Maybe not this fast. Now, aside from just adding intervals to the interval sequence, you could also add a triplet if you wanted, a random note, and even a rest. Maybe let's add more intervals. So these are called interval button sequences. You could always undo something, by the way, using the minus button, and they're a very interesting way to experiment with patterns. So those are the different sequence playback options. Let's take a deeper look at connecting a MIDI keyboard to Misha. So with a keyboard, like I mentioned earlier, you get velocity sensitivity. They're way more playable. And velocity also applies when you're recording. So let's maybe record a tone row this way. Let's make this a bit extreme. And I don't think there's a way to record velocity using Misha, so an external keyboard is certainly handy. And as you can hear, this greatly impacts the sequence. Now, you can map the external keyboard keys to anything you like. It's probably a good idea, though, to try and stick to the default mapping, which I've written here with sticky notes. It's been battle tested quite a bit by Steve and the team at Eventide, and if someone ever puts out a Misha performance course, hopefully we'll all be on the same page. In the default mapping, the keys around D5 are mapped to the different intervals, as you can see written here. And let's maybe not go through the intervals of the tone row, but rather just play directly. So again, go up as much as we want, down as much as we want. So the white keys are mapped to intervals. This gets us back home. The black keys have different other mappings, special functions, like the one, by the way, that you can map the user buttons to. And then you can define regions of the keyboard that just pass through as regular notes that we're used to playing. And you can play the two together. In this case, a pretty short range on the left, passing through the chords I play. And then the right hand playing a Misha improv. Now, you don't need Misha much to riff in C major. You can just play around the white keys, but where it gets interesting, like I said earlier, is finding other interesting keys. Let's go for a different mode this time. Why not? Super Locrian double flat 7. Let's take a look at some, but not all of the interesting black key mappings. So let's say that I wanted to go through the scale. Right? I could do that, but if I wanted to play legato through the scale, it's pretty hard by pressing the same key. And that's what the same interval button is for. So I could go through the scale like this. And then down the scale like this. And I wouldn't have to do that, obviously, with intervals of 1. Anyway, that's the same interval option. And again, you could program these buttons to do that. Random is always fun. And that happens if you have wrap turned on and the range isn't wide enough. Anyway, I don't know about you, but I don't think I could play major this fast. Not to mention Locrian double flat 7. And a few other interesting options. Chromatic 1 can veer off the scale if you want. Then there's undo and undo -1, undo +1. Now, obviously this takes getting used to, and it's just nice to try and work out your own riffs based on what resonates with you. I mentioned Steve from Eventide has been at this for a while. There are a few videos of him performing. I asked Eventide to include a snippet of Steve jamming in the Raga 3 scale. Now, clearly Steve has quite a bit of proficiency with this, but I chatted with him. He's not aiming at specific notes, but rather more along the lines of, like I mentioned earlier, do I want my melody to go up or down and how much? If it veers too far off course, you can bring it back. And by the way, you don't need to just improvise in one key or scale. You can swap keys and scales with MIDI note or MIDI CC commands. Let's take a look at this behind the scenes. In the settings, if we go to MIDI and then to MIDI mapping, you can map every single incoming MIDI note and every single MIDI CC. And you can also look at the existing mappings. So the initial notes to the left of D5 just pass through. But then as we approach MIDI note 74, that's D5, that's our home button. Then 75 is same pitch, 76 is 0, and this continues, +1, the random function. Now, like I said, I think it's best that you don't change the default mappings, but you can just pick any other note or any other MIDI CC, and then choose from any number of commands. including, for example, changing the scale. And if we head on down into here, just go by name and pick any one of the number of scales and modes available in here. And like I mentioned earlier, the same applies to CV inputs. So we go to the CV inputs, choose any one of the three pairs. Let's go for, say, this pair, CV input Z. You can choose a voltage range and then basically map any one of 11 different steps between 0 to 5 volts if you chose that range. And each of these steps can do any one of the things that we talked about earlier. Say, change the scale to whatever you want. So those are MIDI and CV mappings. Another important option here is presets. You've got 18 presets. The first 9 are accessible by holding this shift button and just pressing one of the interval buttons. And presets load immediately. There's no load times as long as it's one of the presets, one of the 18 presets that are stored in the memory. Now, a cool function here, you can save presets either with a tone row or without a tone row. If you save them without a tone row, which is in this case presets 9 through 18, then it'll change the scale but keep the tone row. So a nice performance technique and a nice way to change chords. If you've got a certain pattern and you want to apply a different key or different scale to it, you can do that by loading up a preset that doesn't have a tone row inside it. 18 presets, by the way, aren't too much, but you can save them to a VSD card and load up a different batch of 18. Okay, so that's Misha. This is the part of the video where I typically talk about pros and cons, and these are typically compared to the competition. However, Misha is the only interval sequencer that I'm aware of, so it's kind of like talking about the pros and cons of a unicorn. It might be more powerful with more than 1 horsepower, or if there was one with wings, I'd recommend you get that one. But for now, this is the only game in town. Still, there are a few things you need to be aware of. On the hardware side, these buttons aren't great for performance and they're not velocity sensitive, so you can't rely on them much to play rhythmically, but if you're just into creating sequences, then it doesn't matter much. But if you want to use Misha as a performance instrument, you'll want to connect a MIDI keyboard to it. Then on the firmware side, probably my biggest wishlist feature is to have an option to create sequences that aren't limited to one occurrence of a note per sequence, and potentially sequences that are longer than the number of notes in the scale. You could obviously use an external sequencer to sequence Misha, which would be very odd. Say if I recorded this sequence. So there are ways around the tone row sequence limitation, but it would be nice if you could just do that on board. Then another feature on my wish list is the ability to customize the chords in the 9-chord chord bank. And I'm getting really greedy here, but it would be nice to have more than one track going at a time. As long as we've got Misha around, there are 3 CV gate outputs. It would be great if you could have 1, 2, or even 3 different Mishas working in parallel. So those are my complaints, because on this channel, even unicorns can be a little bit sparklier. On the pros side, I kind of see Misha as 2 totally different things. On one side, it's a very interesting generative sequencer that really opens up a new way of sequencing. Misha changes how you think about melodies, kind of like how Metropolis changes how you think about rhythms. In both cases, you're kind of thinking about what happens next as opposed to living within a rigid structure. And the result is a sequencer that you can have a very interesting dialogue with, exploring melodic phrases, kicking ideas back and forth, kind of like having a writing partner by your side. And then the second, and in my opinion, almost totally different thing Misha is a live performance and improvisation instrument, letting you easily feel your way up and down multiple different interesting scales where you're focusing on rhythm, emotion, and the direction your melody is going, as opposed to which specific notes you need to play. Now, a word of warning, if you want to play specific melodies, you might have an easier time just playing with a regular keyboard. I showed you earlier how I struggled with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. But if you're interested in a live jam, exploring the ideas that can come up with playing different scales, you have no business playing, or at least no experience playing, Misha is well worth a look. So that's it for Misha. There are plenty more generative tips and ideas in my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.